I think you need to start with your enlistment, don't you?
Well, I thought it would be best to start how I became interested in airplanes.
All
I
right.
think that's a good start.
Okay, that's all right.
And when we lived on the St. Johns River, I was about 7 years old, and an airplane, which we didn't see any at all that far out in the country, flew up and down the river. And I watched the airplane, and it was a World War I biplane, commonly called a Jenny. And a lady, I found out from my dad that a lady in Orange City owned the airplane and kept it at a little grass field outside of Orange City, and she hired a pilot to fly it, and it was a two-seater, and she flew with him to just observe. And I looked at that airplane and I thought, wow, someday I'm going to fly an airplane like that. My cousin had loaned me some Buck Rogers comic books, and Buck Rogers was, back in those days, was the rocket guy that went all the way to the moon and walked on the moon and everything before it was ever thought of being walked on the moon in later years like we do now. Anyway, time went on, and I went to high school, and some of my friends went out to the Jacksonville airport and watched airplanes and did all kind of work around the hangar to get free rides. And I never did get a chance to do that. And I never was in an airplane or flew in an airplane until after I joined the Air Force. And when World War II came along and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, that day I'd gone to the movies with my sister in downtown Jacksonville, and then not long after that, well, I decided that I'd go down and make application to join the Air Force. And I went down to the post office and went through all of their discussions and examinations and physical exams, and I found out later that I almost didn't make it. My feet were almost too flat. I don't know what flat feet had to do with flying an airplane, but nevertheless, I did pass, and I was put on reserve status, and October of 1942, and finally in about February of 43, why I was called up, sent orders to report to Miami Beach for active duty in a pre-aviation cadet program. And down there they used the Miami Beach hotels for housing military people, and we were on 79th Avenue in the beach at the Broadmoor Hotel, and of course they had it set up just like an Army system. They didn't have the regular hotel beds. They had double-deck Army bunks, and boy, reveille sounded over the intercom system, and you had to pile out and get your clothes on and head for the parking lot and line up. And I never had any military training or marching or anything like that, so it was different for me. And when the first time I went out, well, I didn't have my cap on, and some sergeant stopped me and says, "Where's your cap, mister?" So I took it off my belt, put it on my head real quick, and fell in. We marched off to breakfast. And after Miami Beach, went through all of that, then went to University of Tennessee on a college training detachment. And at the University of Tennessee, I took regular college courses in algebra and all the other things that they had. And then we had a lot of marching and calisthenics and all those things. And also, they had us scheduled to get 10 hours in a Piper Cub out at the Knoxville airport. Well, we went out to the Knoxville airport, and they had these little Piper Cubs and civilian instructors to give us our 10 hours dual instruction time. And so when that was be my first airplane ride, and this was a tandem seat little airplane, and the instructor sat up front and I sat in back, and of course I couldn't see too much, but he took the taxied out and took the airplane off and made a couple of turns and said, "Okay, you fly it." And I never had my hands on the stick of an airplane before, or the controls of an airplane. And so I just did what he did, and he told me how to watch out at the wings and make sure that they were level, or how to know whether I was climbing or descending by watching the nose on the horizon. And we flew around for about 55 minutes and come in and landed, and he filled out a report and filled out a little logbook for my 55 minutes. And later on, I saw a copy of his written report, and it said, interested but timid. Well, who wouldn't be timid the first time you ever up in an airplane? You fly it. Well, that was all I got of the 10 hours, and we went on to Nashville, Tennessee, and that was the big depot where they tested you and questioned you and everything else, and that's where they separated the pre-aviation cadets for pilots and navigators and bombardiers. And they also found out whether you wanted to be a bomber pilot, a transport pilot, or a fighter pilot. I, of course, always told them I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I thought that was the thing to be. And so they, I didn't know the results of that, of course. They never told you anything. From there, they sent us to Montgomery, Alabama. And that was the first time we really got into the aviation cadet part of it, and that was the aviation cadet school. And there, why, mostly we had classes and on all kinds of military subjects, including aircraft identification, and of course we had calisthenics and marching and lining up before we went anywhere in formation. And of course, when we lined in formation outside the barracks, while there was upperclassmen, and they were in charge, and they walked up and down the line, and they'd stop in front of you and do all kind of weird things, like say, "Did you shine that belt, mister?" And they talking about the brass belt buckle, and you look down at the brass belt buckle, and he said, "Who told you to look down? Attention, eyes straight ahead." Or he'd ask you about your shoes or something like that to get you to look down so he could give you a bad time. We went to, we marched to the chow hall to eat, and they had bench tables and aisles down between them, and sat on the benches, and you didn't go to get your food. They served the food at the end of the table, and of course this upperclassman for each table. And what really was different is they told you had to eat a square meal, and a square meal meant you couldn't look down at your plate. You looked straight ahead, you took your fork, and you took a bite, and you brought it up, and then square into your mouth, and then back square and down again to the plate. And that was kind of difficult to do when you were used to looking at what you were eating and ate in a more relaxed manner. Then we went from there, and I believe I got Nashville a little ahead. We might have gone to Nashville after that, and was classified as a pilot or navigator or bombardier. And anyway, from one or the other of those places, why, they sent us to primary. and I got assigned to a single engine primary at Union City, Tennessee. And this was a small town in West Tennessee near the Mississippi River. And it was north of Memphis. When we came, while the upperclassmen there were just graduating and going on to another flying school, and they were flying the PT-17 biplanes that were referred to as the Yellow Peril, because they had a narrow landing gear and they were easy to ground loop and wreck and everything. But they got rid of those, and our class was the first one to fly PT-23s. And PT-23 had a radial engine just like a PT-17. It was a 220 horsepower Continental, and it was the little airplane. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking at one later at air shows, I realized that was a flimsy little thing. The wings were all made out of wood, and they were covered with fabric, but it was different to start it because they had a crank that you put in the side of the fuselage up in the engine part, and someone else, you got in the cockpit and got the chocks were in place so that it wouldn't roll forward, and you got your controls and your gas and spark all set, and then the guy outside, he turned the crank, and it was just like you cranking a Model T Ford. I don't know if you know that Model T Fords had a crank, and the same thing. He turned the crank, and when he got the flywheel going, a maximum speed, he could crank it. While then he'd take the crank out, and you'd say clear, and he'd return clear, and inside the cockpit was a little wire on the panel in a little circle about the size of a quarter, and you put your finger in that and you pulled it, and that engaged the flywheel in the engine, and the prop turned over and it fired and started up. Now the first flights, of course, was with an instructor, and these were civilian instructors again. They didn't have military instructors for primary, and the Air Force at that time, it was Army Air Force. They went out and they flew in the back seat now, and you flew in the front seat, and went out and took off, and of course the first time, while the instructor would take off, and he flew around and showed various turns and maneuvers and come back, and he landed the airplane. And then the next time I went out and he showed more procedures and maneuvers, and he said, well, I'm going to show you a stall. And so he pulled the airplane up in a stall, and it shuddered and fell off, and he recovered, and he said, okay, now you do one. Well, I thought I was doing the same thing he did, and I pulled the airplane up in the stall, except I pulled it up too sharp. And boy, when it fell off, he yelled, he says, I didn't tell you to do a hammerhead stall. No, I didn't know a hammerhead stall from a screwdriver stall. And anyway, he told me, he said, don't pull it up so sharp. And so I did it again, and it satisfied him. We went on to the other maneuvers, figure eights and turns and so forth. Then that airplane, in those days, they didn't have radios in them. And he talked to you with what they called a Gosport tube. And it was a little, sort of like a funnel in the back cockpit on a clip on the side, and he'd take it off and put it to his mouth and talk through the funnel. And it's sort of like talking with two cans and a string in between them, was a rubber tube, and that went to your headset, and you could hear him okay. We had about one more time of dual instruction, and these things were about an hour each. And after I had about 3 or 4 hours, I landed the airplane and taxied back to take off. It was just a grass field, and he said, well, I saw him getting out of the rear cockpit. He got out of the rear cockpit and stood on the wing and said, "Well, you're doing fine." Says, "You can take it up on your own now, and come back in and make a couple of touch and go landings, and then you can come back in and land and come to a full stop." And so when he got out, why, of course, you always press the rudder pedals and look back at the rudder to make sure that the cables are all hooked up and it was moving when you press the rudder pedal, and you move the stick to move the ailerons to make sure they were okay. When I pressed the rudder pedals, well, I thought the cables were broken because they were so loose, you know, and I looked back to see if the rudder was moving. It was moving. All of a sudden I realized he was riding with his feet on the rudders so heavy, and when he was in the airplane, he wasn't going to let me over control it. Anyway, I took off, went around and made a couple of smooth landings and taxied back, and boy, he was real pleased, and he come up and signed off me as soloing. And I was real pleased too, because after those few hours to be able to fly an airplane by my own and never having been in one but once before, I thought that was quite an accomplishment.
So you had, what, about 13 hours of flight time or less?
Well, including solo, it was about 15 hours altogether. And before we graduated, well, one day I took that. We used to take that little airplane up and do all kinds of weird things that I wouldn't do with one now. But we'd turn that sucker upside down, and we did barrel rolls and everything else with it. We'd turn that thing upside down and fly it upside down as long as we could. Now, this was a carbureted engine, and it would finally run out of fuel, and the engine would quit, and the prop would stop. And of course, we were 5,000 or 6,000 feet when we did this, and it was high enough to then turn the airplane right side up again and dive down and to get the prop to windmilling and start the engine again. Oh. And we didn't think anything about that. And we didn't think anything about doing barrel rolls, snap rolls, and those spars in that wing and all the wing, interior of the wing was just wood, just spruce wood with a fabric covering on it, painted on top of the fabric. One day I took this thing out and on a kind of a cross country on my own, and it was cloudy and the ceiling was kind of low. It wasn't but about 1,000 feet. When I got out a few miles from the field, 4 or 5 miles from the field, well, all of a sudden here come the fog. And boy, I mean, it was foggy from the clouds all the way down to the deck. I could see okay, but I couldn't see more than maybe a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile. I thought it was an awful short distance. And I realized that I didn't know, all of a sudden I didn't realize, I didn't know where the field was. So I picked out a crossroad and started circling that and making bigger and bigger circles. And I kept carefully looking as in the distance as I made the circle. And finally, I saw a green light flashing. I said, "That's it, that's the tower light." And so I headed back to the field and made a landing, and nobody ever knew I was lost. I didn't tell them. Now, the way they control the traffic there, why, when you come into the traffic pattern, why, they would give you a green light when you got into position to land. It was okay to land. If they gave you a red light, well, you had to go around again. You had to watch out and go around again. And the same way on taxiing out to takeoff, they use red or green or flashing red and green, and that meant to stop and wait till they gave you a green to taxi on out. And of course, these little airplanes were tail draggers, and you couldn't see directly in front of you. So when you taxied, you had to do S-turns so that you'd clear the nose. You could see around the nose of the airplane to taxi. Anyway, I graduated from that, and now we're heading for basic training. Went to Newport, Arkansas, and there they had BT-13s and BT-15s. Now these were canopied airplanes. Little PT-23 didn't have any canopy in those open cockpits. And the BT-13s and 15s were canopy airplanes. And they had fixed gear, though. Either of these airplanes I flew up to then didn't have retract gear. And but this BT-13, one we liked to fly most because the BT-15 had an engine that would leak oil and get on the windscreen, the windshield. And finally had an instructor fly with you again and went through the procedures of all the same things. And then we'd go out to an auxiliary field. It was paved runways, a little field away from the main field, and practice landings. And went out there and practiced landings. And now this BT-13 had a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney. And the 15 had a Wright engine in it, and it was the one that leaked oil. I don't know why it leaked oil rather than the Pratt & Whitney, but anyway. And we landed, and we'd been shooting landings and turn around to take off again. And now this airplane, it had a radio and an intercom in it. We didn't operate without a radio and also an intercom. And so when we taxied around to take off again, he said, just a minute. And so he got out and buckled his belt back up in the seat and got out and stood on the wing and said, okay, he said, you can do it good enough. Go ahead and make 3 touch-and-go landings and 1 full stop landing and come back and pick me up. And so I soloed again. And when I rode home the next time, I told my dad, I said, Dad, I soloed this monster. It has a 450 horsepower engine, and I'll tell you right now, they don't make anything I can't fly. And that's the way I felt about it the whole rest of the time I flew, that if it flew, I could fly. And I was not an extrovert type person. I was really, like that original instructor said, I was a timid type person, an introvert. And I'm surprised that I felt that way. I didn't shoot my mouth off or talk about it a lot. And then that was the first time at basic training that we had night flying. And of course, you had runway lights and you had landing lights, and you just flew around the local area and come back and shot some landings, and so you were qualified to fly at night. And took that BT-13 up one time and decided I was going to, of course they told us don't go above 10,000 feet because we didn't have oxygen. But I took that thing up to 18,000 feet, and I decided I was going to see how many turns it would make in a spin on a crossroad. So I picked out a crossroad, and I was away from the field and no other traffic around. I pulled that thing up and went wing over into a spin, and it spin right on the crossroad. And as long as you held the stick back and the rudder in, why, it would keep on spinning around. But but then even doing that, after about 5 or 6 turns, it would start coming out of the spin, and the nose, instead of being straight down, it would come up on the horizon and make kind of a roll going straight down. And anyway, I counted the turns, and I think from 18,000 to 5,000, it was 28 turns. And I didn't think anything about that. Shucks, I could fly that thing. Of course, we flew that upside down, right side up, snap rolls, slow rolls, loops, everything else. And graduated from there and went on to Advance at Jackson, Mississippi. And Advance, we had an Advance airplane. It was an AT-6. Later they called them a Texan. We didn't know that they called them Texan then. It was made by North American. It was similar to the BT-13 and 15 with a sliding canopy, except that it had retract gear and a bigger engine. Now we stepped up to 650 horsepower, another 200 horsepower. And there, boy, I had an instructor that was, well, he looked like Johnny Weissmuller. You never knew him, but he was in the early, he was a Olympics champion, and he was in the early Tarzan movies. He was Tarzan.
First Tarzan?
Yeah, he was the first Tarzan. Yeah. And this instructor looked just like him. Big, tall guy, good bit over 6 feet tall, big hands, twice as big as my hands. And he was unhappy because when he graduated from advanced, he wanted to go into fighters, and instead they decided he was too tall and too big to cram into one of those fighter cockpits, and they made him an instructor. And he was really unhappy. One day he and I were out, and he said, well, we were flying along about 1,500 feet, and of course we had radios and intercom again, but this instructor, he didn't need to use the intercom. He yelled so loud, he didn't even need to pick up the microphone and talk into it. Even with your helmet on, you could hear him, the engine and everything. And if you did something wrong, boy, he could cuss like any 10 worst sailors you ever thought of cussing, you know. And we were flying about 1,500 feet, and he says, well, how would you like to see an Immelman? And I said, from 1,500 feet? Now that maneuver is something that takes a little more than 1,500 feet to do. To be safe, you really need to be 3,000 to 5,000 feet to be able to do it, because you flying along, you turn the airplane upside down and you pull it through, all the way through, just straight through and back up. And that maneuver takes some altitude. Of course, I couldn't say anything to him. He was so rough and tough. I said, yes, sir. And so he rolled that sucker upside down and pulled it through right on top of the trees. But he didn't think I knew what he did. I never did tell him I knew. But I watched him, and I watched what happened in the airplane. And when he rolled it upside down, he put down about half flaps and put the gear down. And that slowed the airplane down enough where he could pull it through the Immelman at 1,500 feet. When he pulled it out over the trees, well, he pulled the gear up and the flaps up again. And of course, he didn't say anything about that. He said, don't you try that at 1,500 feet. I said, yes, sir. Because you just answered him, sir, and now then we had military instructors. It wasn't any civilians. And boy, he had about 6 students in the morning and 6 students in the afternoon. And if you flew with him in the morning, you went to ground school in the afternoon, or vice versa. And when he took a student up, everybody went with him out to the flight line and stood at attention while he and the student got in the airplane, cranked it up, and taxied off. Then you went back to the ready room. But you also had to watch the clock, because you knew that he was only going to fly about 45, 50 minutes with him. And when he come back in and taxied up the line, the other 5 students better be standing there at attention. And I mean, they better stand there at attention. And one that's going up next better have his parachute on and ready to go. And one day we were standing out there at the flight line at attention and waiting for him to taxi up, and ahead of him, boy, this brand new silver-colored Republic Thunderbolt, P-47 Thunderbolt, come in and buzzed the field and did a overhead pass and come in and landed and taxied up to the flight line. And boy, we were all looking at it thinking, wow, it would be really something to fly that. And the cockpit canopy went back, and the pilot made entries in the log and unbuckled and threw the leg over the cockpit and climbed out on the wing and pulled the helmet off, and this dark brunette hair flowed down all the way down her shoulders, and it was a girl.
Wow.
and this was the WAFs, the Women's Army Air Force waves, I guess they call them instead of WAFs. WAFs in the Navy, WAFs. and they did ferry duty. And she was checked out in that P-47, and she was ferrying it to some base to go overseas. And another time with this instructor, we called him the Rock, and he didn't know it behind his back. Well, we referred to him as the Rock, and because he was hard as rock, as far as we were concerned. He was hard with everybody, not just me. And he'd gone to an auxiliary